Thank you for your kind words, Andrew. I've enjoyed working with TAPS enormously, and thank you for this invitation. So I'm going to try to pull together a little bit and maybe make some comparisons between some of the models that you've already seen, and then we'll go into a good discussion, which we'll invite you to participate in. Before I start, I too want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're here today, and I won't try to pronounce their name because as a Canadian, I'm sure I will get it quite wrong. So frameworks and tools for systems approaches. I think we probably want to start with a few definitions. The first is system, and I tend to go to Donella Meadows for my definition of system, which is a set of things, people, cells, molecules, or whatever, interconnected in such a way that they produce their own pattern of behavior over time. So that's the kind of definition I use. Now, when it comes to finding a definition of systems approach, that's actually quite a bit more challenging. I found this one in the literature, or by using Google, of course, a line of thought, and in this case from the management field, which stresses the, and I've underlined this, interactive nature and interdependence of external and internal factors. And I think that's the part of the definition that we're going to pretty much focus on today. A colleague gave me this definition of systems thinking yesterday, a very academic approach in which they synthesized systems thinking definitions from 8 different researchers into a classic academic framing of systems thinking as a set of synergistic analytic skills used to improve the capability of identifying and understanding systems, predicting their behaviors, and devising modifications to them in order to produce desired effects. These skills work together as a system. Does anybody understand what I just said? And they built it based on the model that's in the lower right-hand corner of the slide. So anyways, just keep in mind interconnections, interdependencies, and we'll be in good shape. In fact, we'll use my favorite picture of interconnections and interdependencies, which is the Obesity System Map, which people who've been working in prevention, particularly in chronic disease prevention, will have seen this. It's been around for more than 10 years. And as I always say when I use this map, I put whatever label I need on it because you can't read it anyways. But the point, the reason I like to start most of my talks with this picture because it really emphasizes the interdependency aspect of a complex adaptive system. And it's the part of a complex adaptive system that makes it complex, not complicated, and really contributes to the challenge that we face in trying to solve complex problems. And I do like to make that distinction between complex and complicated. So I often say complex is not the same as complicated or simple. This illustrates the characteristics that articulate the difference between simple or complicated systems and complex. And you should listen when somebody's talking about complexity. Sometimes they slip back and forth and use complicated to mean complex. Now, we don't have time to go through all these in detail and talk about them, but certainly things like heterogeneity. And when it comes to prevention, we know there's many, many different genes, for example, that contribute to a person's body weight. And as a result, clearly we're heterogeneous, and applying one kind of intervention in prevention is not necessarily going to work. But also although maybe somewhat jargony, deterministic and stochastic are important. Stochastic meaning random. So, airplanes are complicated. Then you put a pilot in them, they start to become complex because sometimes there's random behaviors associated with individuals. But even in the area of prevention, I like to quote a study in which they looked retrospectively at people who'd gained and lost weight over a period of time and asked them what the trigger was for that weight loss or weight gain, and the list is the same. Losing a spouse, a divorce, those sorts of things. They trigger people to either lose weight or gain weight, but it depends on the individual in terms of what you get. So these are the kinds of characteristics that make up a complex system. Now, we're talking about frameworks and tools. I use these definitions. I tend to be a little bit interchangeable, but a framework is just a broad overview or outline or a skeleton that supports a particular approach to a specific objective. And it's going to be important as you think about what framework or tool you want to use, what your objective is. What is it you're trying to accomplish and communicate? And a tool, and I use tool there to describe and implement, and it can be a concept as well. Tools can be concepts. And some of the frameworks we're going to talk about can be used as tools as well as just frameworks. So these are my key messages. Frameworks and tools can be used for describing complex systems of interest, creating system maps. We've already heard something about that. System frameworks can be used to support shared understanding, and that's an important component of acting in complex systems. Systems frameworks can be used to guide action as well as support shared understanding, and they can be used for analysis and evaluation. And we'll talk a little bit about each one of these in the limited amount of time that we have. So describing the system of interest, we've already had some great presentations in this session. In public health, a very common map or model of our circumstances is a social ecological model. And I put this up here to illustrate how bad I think it is as a map or a model for complex adaptive systems, because it doesn't show you anything about interconnections. It illustrates and sort of suggests that you've got these layers of areas that affect an individual and affect the individual's outcomes or prevention, and also that are places for intervention, but it really evokes nothing about the interconnection. So I put it up there as a comparison. I also have Paul's Healthy Weight Action Plan, which we were just discussing before the session, as he points out that although it doesn't look like there's any interconnections here in the way he articulates it, when you're trying to sell the plan within the government structure, it probably is necessary to make it in these discrete areas. But again, it doesn't evoke anything about complexity. Whereas, I think I did press, let's see if this comes up. It's a slow one because it's such a big file. Here's the map that Therese presented in terms of the Glenorchy prevention system. And this one's quite an interesting one because it looks almost a little bit chaotic until you can zero in on a particular section. And clearly it's been a useful tool in the work that they're doing in Glenorchy. It doesn't have a lot of interconnections in it, but maybe that's not important because as you start to unpack it, you begin to see them quite clearly. But of course, Sharon's map shows lots of interconnections and interdependencies, so it evokes the notion that the system that she's working in clearly is complex. And the challenge, of course, in complex systems is when you show somebody a map like this, the common responses are retreat, despair, believing the problem's beyond hope. But what I want to try to convey to you today is that's not necessarily the case. So systems maps can be used as tools. Let's just look at a couple of examples. I come back to the Obesity System Map. Now, this was created by a large group of stakeholders in the UK more than 10 years ago. And although you can't understand what it says, you can actually use it if you blow it up in large frame so that you can actually see it as a tool to talk about cross-government responsibilities in an area like obesity. So in the UK, this was used for a whole of government discussion where different ministries like transportation and education and others came together to say where were they responsible? What places on this map did they have responsibility for? So it was a tool for having a conversation about roles and responsibilities and trying to develop, again, a common understanding of the challenge. We zoomed out on the map, and so what you're seeing here is a version of the map in which each arrow its thickness is proportional to the number of underlying relationships. So it's not really quantitative, but it gives you a sense of where the stakeholders who were developing the map were focusing their attention. And it gave us a real an aha in terms of the potential bias, actually, of the stakeholders who built this particular version. And you can see it in the largest arrow is between food production and food consumption. So the people who built this map really believed there were a lot of aspects of food production that drove food consumption. But there's no return arrow. And certainly if you work in the food industry, you would argue that what people consume plays an important role in what they produce. That's not to absolve them of the responsibility they have or the role that they play in driving consumption using advertising and other things. But clearly if people don't eat things, they're not going to be able to sell them. So this is a form of analysis, if you will, of how the individuals who were here involved in building this map articulated the important responsibilities. And it's also presented as a cautionary note that like a famous modeler said, all models are wrong, some are useful. It's probably also true that all systems maps are wrong in some fashion, but many are useful for dialogue. What about frameworks and tools for action? So Paul presented this one so that he could illustrate where in the prevention system they felt that ACT Health could act, and I think it's a good one in that sense in terms of a framework for action for government. I particularly like Donella Meadows' work on places to intervene in a complex system, because she takes the frame of system and thinks about it a little bit differently, where she talks about the hardest things to change in a system are the deeply held beliefs, the paradigm under which the system operates. And going down, that drives the goals, it sets the structure of the system, it plays a role in the feedback loops and delays that exist in the system, and then all the fiddly bits down at the bottom, the constant numbers and parameters. And the key here is the recognition that at the top of the pyramid here, at the top of the places to intervene, are things that are very difficult to change, but when they change, they're very powerful and very effective for change. And if we start to think about where the evidence lies, it tends to be down at the bottom of this list. Now, we felt that this was a really interesting way to think about a system, and we wanted to analyze strategies for addressing obesity, but we quickly learned 12 levels is not a great framework for analysis. So we developed what we call the intervention level framework, which is just a little bit easier, but it sort of compacts some of what Donella Meadows had. So at the top, paradigm, deeply held beliefs, goals, structure, feedback loops and delays, and structural elements. And we found this to be actually a fairly useful framework for analysis. And so we analyzed a series, that slide is missing, is it? Is it there? No, it is not. I somehow have left the slide out. Okay, I'm just going to go back for a second and just say that we use this to analyze strategies for looking at obesity, and found that, in fact, the bulk of what you find in a strategy is down at that structural element level, because that's where the evidence tends to lie. And we rarely think about the paradigm under which a system actually operates. So this is to encourage. We've also used this, well, maybe that's it, it's in a different section, for action. We have used this for, sorry, my apologies, but we've used this as a conversation tool in a number of workshops where we engage people in a discussion about what those deeply held beliefs are. Another framework for action is Trish Greenhall's framework for diffusion of innovation. I particularly like this framework and because it really articulates that in a complex adaptive system, you can't let something happen. You can't make something happen, but what you have to do is to help it happen. So managerial top-down approaches don't work that well in a complex system, and just letting things happen don't help build the coherence that you need across a large system to move in a single direction. So I think this is a helpful framework. The 5 conditions of collective impact, again, is another framework that can be used for action, and it's very concrete in speaking about the common agenda, the shared measurement, the mutually reinforcing activities. Now, you're starting to see that there's some common themes that run through each of these, but the other thing to keep in mind is that depending on where you're going and what you're trying to communicate, one may be more useful than another. I like this framework for partnership development because we talk about partnerships a lot, and we don't often articulate the distinction between things like sponsorship. Some people talk about those as partnerships, which tend to be, make the organizations tend to be relatively independent, and the relationship tends to be transactional. Whereas there are also things like alliances where the relationships start to become more interdependent and collaborative, versus true engaged partnerships where the organizations involved are truly interconnected and there's real co-ownership. I'm not trying to imply that there's anything wrong with any one of these, but the important value of the framework is to be able to articulate and more clearly describe the nature of the relationship you're trying to build, and to think about the parameters that go with it. This is Wheatley's framework for influencing emergence, where she talks about how you go from networks to communities of practice to systems of influence. And because time is short, I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but what she does is articulate how you can help loosely affiliated groups of people who are mostly there for self-interest to move into being a community of practice, or ultimately what we really are trying to build in public health are systems of influence. This is just language, I call it a framework for building trust, but building trust is an important component of public health and a very important component of working in complex systems, because the more trust you have when you're working in a system, the less complex it is to work in that system. So just giving it some language and understanding the difference between simple trust, authentic trust, and cordial hypocrisy can be fairly helpful for articulating how to get there. There are frameworks for adaptation instead of setting a goal. This is the Common Plan, Do, Study, Act kind of framework. And I call this my framework for solutions to complex problems. It's kind of a summary of a number of the frameworks we've just talked about, like building authentic trust, setting functional goals, distributing decision, action, and authority, moving from let it happen to help it happen, those sorts of things. And I've labeled it a framework because I really like the collection, and I think it can ultimately, maybe academically it's not quite there as a tested framework, but it's a useful set of things to think about when you're trying to address complex systems. So just quickly, I'll go through a couple of systems frameworks for analysis. This is where I got myself confused before. But this is one paper that I found that I think did a very nice job of taking 4 characteristics of complex adaptive systems and using them to rate papers around interventions for type 2 diabetes. And they actually showed, if you look at this table, which has the total number of complex adaptive systems characteristics in the column, in the left-hand column, versus the impact, and they just used a simple rating scale of 0, 0.5, and 1 for the impact of the intervention. So this was actually a synthesis article across these interventions. And they found a distinct correlation between the number of complex adaptive systems characteristics and the impact of the intervention. So I think we need to do way more of this kind of work if we're going to, whoops, I was timing myself. I'm behind, clearly. But the point being that I think this is the kind of empirical work we need way more of in order for complex adaptive systems to be an acceptable approach to addressing complex problems. Here's where I confuse myself. We use this framework to look at recommendations to address obesity across a number of strategies, and you can see that the vast majority really focus on the things that we can measure and prove that there's evidence for, and therefore they get packaged into strategies. We really need to think more about how we use things like creating feedback loops, new feedback loops, or removing feedback loops as an intervention strategy in and of itself. And this is a framework that was developed in Canada for measuring research impact. I'm just illustrating it because I think it's a helpful way to think about as we build the case for organizations like TAPC and others that are doing work to build capacity and advance knowledge in systems approaches. We need to build the case that these things then ultimately can lead to informed decision making, and the things that our government and our policymakers want us to show, which is that there's ultimately health impacts and broad economic and social impacts. So just to quickly recap, I think frameworks and tools can be useful for describing complex systems of interest. Creating system maps is in and of itself helpful, and the maps help to build support for a shared understanding. And these frameworks can also be used to guide our action as well as analytic frames and tools. So thank you very much. Okay.